something a little bit different today. I'm looking at sort of the do's and don'ts of stamping and the easy mistakes you can make, and I'm an authority on this because I make them all. So I have made these mistakes and this is how I've learned from it. The first thing when you're thinking about stamping is to think about the quality of your product, because if you've got a rubbish product, you're not going to get a great image. Now, having said that, it doesn't mean that you have to spend a fortune to get a good product. This is a Stampin' Up product, which are quite expensive, but, well, it depends how you look at it, because they can be really versatile, but really well thought out. And these are photopolymer, and then you have the unmounted red rubber from Stampin' Up, and you also have the mounted red rubber from Stampin' Up. This is mounted red rubber, but it's not Stampin' Up. So there's lots of different manufacturers of stamps out there. There's lots of different companies that make stamps, and some of them are really, really fabulous quality, and some of them aren't so good quality. And sometimes, even with the best quality ones, you might find a bit of a mistake. So your stamp. If there's something wrong with your stamp, there's going to be something wrong with your stamping, as a rule of thumb. So I'm just going to, this was a really inexpensive set that I bought, and that just says Christmas Joy. Let's just see how that stamps. Well, it's stamped okay, kind of thing. So yeah, that would probably, it's a little bit, it might come out better the second time. Sometimes with the photopolymer stamps, they have a little bit of a film on them. I mean, it's not perfect. It's kind of coming out. I mean, these letters are a bit, it's not perfect. Now with a Stampin' Up stamp, you might expect a little bit of a crisper image. Let me just have a look. And I'm not choosing one for any other reason than it's really close to me. Anything I use here, I'm only using it because it's close to me. So this stamp is, we'll put it on the same block. Stamp it up in the same way, ink it up in the same way, and we'll print it out in the same way. Now look how much more, I think you can probably see, look how much more precise that is compared to that. And I've used the same ink, the same block, and the same paper. So you can see there is a little bit of a difference between the quality of the stamps. And if I use the Stampin' Up photopolymer stamp, again, you get that same pristine quality. So rule number one is buy good quality stamps. If you want good quality images, buy good quality stamps. And that doesn't mean they have to be Stampin' Up necessarily, and it doesn't mean that they have to cost you a fortune. But just check, you know, if you're having trouble with your stamp, that is obviously the stamp. It's not the ink, it's not anything you're doing wrong. So that's rule number one. Rule number two, or mistake number two, is ink. Now, sometimes your problem can be your ink. It's not your stamp at all. Now, I'm just going to use one of these little craft ink, crystal craft ink pads, and I'm going to use the same block. Let me clean off what was on it, and I'm going to use that. And look at that. That is not anything approaching the quality of this print here. And that's because the ink quality isn't as good. and that'll be reflected in the price of that ink. Here I've got some StazOn, which is, unlike the Stampin' Up, which are water-based, this is and made for paper. This is made for any surface. Now look at that, look how clear and crisp that image is. So that ink's really, you know, it's obviously really good compared to the purple there. Okay, so it doesn't, I'm not saying it has to be Stampin' Up ink, but your ink does have to be a good quality. Okay, Stampin' Up inks are all water based, so if I was to get that wet now, it'd go all wishy-washy. StazOn is an archival ink, so it's a fast drying, and it's not water based, so it's not going to come off if I run some water across it. Stampin' Up does have some archival inks which are retiring, and this is one of them, the basic black. Now, one of the things you need to be aware of, is if you're stamping in basic black archival, is it just takes a little bit longer to dry, and also it's better, I find, if you're stamping onto vellum or window sheet. However, if you are stamping onto vellum or window sheet, then just allow it to dry a little bit more before you use it. That's another tip, actually. Sorry, I forgot about that. So the next tip then is to consider your paper. Now, Stampin' Up paper is made especially to be stamped on. It's formulated in such a way, people sometimes think that the cardstock is not as strong or robust, but it is. It's just that it's been compressed and compressed so that it takes ink really well. So if you're stamping onto a different paper, you might not get the same result. Okay, so if you're stamping onto a poor quality paper, a glossy paper, a paper that's too thin, a paper that's too porous, you might get bleeding and stuff. So if you are having problems, if you know you've got good quality stamps and you know you've got good quality ink and you're still having problems, then look at your quality of your paper, because the better the quality of your paper, the better the quality of your stamping again. Now think about different types of paper that you might stamp onto. So stamping onto the normal paper, I'm going to take this green Emerald Envy ink. I'm going to use this flower. Stamping onto normal Stampin' Up paper, it's a nice crisp image and it's dry more or less straight away. That's because it's water based, okay? But if I'm going to stamp onto vellum, it's not dry immediately. So if I'm stamping onto vellum, I need to be really precise as normal, but I also need to allow it to dry before I touch it or start folding it or moving it around. And the same with window sheet. And if I was stamping onto foils or onto glossy paper, can't think why I'd want to stamp onto foils or glossy paper. But the other thing is that obviously because it's water based, if it gets wet or you're using a watercolour brush or an aqua painter around it, it will make the stamp bleed. So then what you want to do, if you want something that's going to go outside or whatever, use an archival ink, which takes a little bit longer to dry, but once it's dry it will stay put. I mean, it's more or less done now, it's bleeding a little bit, smudging a little bit, but once it's dry it will stay put. It's not going to be affected by watercolouring or anything like that. If you're using markers or whatever around it, it's not going to bleed into your colour. So do think about your type of ink, your stamp, your paper, and what you're actually stamping onto. And again, just as with anything else, you get good and poor qualities of vellum as well. So different ones might react in different ways. So if you've seen a demonstrator do something using vellum and they've stamped onto it and it's looked amazing, and you've tried it and it's looked really cack, then that might be because your vellum's not as good a quality as the one that they were using. Right, the next thing is, if you are using stamps that require a block, then your block's important. I didn't used to think it was. I used to think, oh, anything will do, I'll just stick it on a plastic lid or whatever. But your block is important. And some blocks, like this one for instance, are very straight around the edge. It's just a piece of Perspex. And some are moulded so you can get a nice hold of them. And it does make a difference. It really, I used to think it doesn't really matter, it doesn't make a difference, what's the difference between that and that? But it just does make a difference to be able to get a hold of it, you know, with this nice groove, and for it to be really clear so you can really see through what's going on the other side. And it does help to have blocks of different sizes too. You don't need to buy a full range of them, but a nice, you know, a couple of different sizes is a good idea. And always use the right size block for your stamp, because it's not going to work if you've got your image hanging over the side. That's going to be another mistake. It's not going to stamp right. Okay. Now, this is the other thing you have to think about, your blocks. Because if you've got wood mounted stamp, if you need to do some really precise stamping and you're using wood mounted stamps, then seeing, you know, even if you've got your image on the other side, seeing exactly where they're going to turn out is going to be really difficult. So you might want to consider, if it's something that needs to be precise, you might want to consider using the Perspex blocks, getting the unmounted red rubber or photopolymer and using the Perspex blocks so that you can see better where you're positioning them. Now, obviously, this hasn't, you can see through with the photopolymer, you can see exactly where your stamp is. With the red rubber, you can't. Now, normally with red rubber, you do get stickers to put on the back to show you the positioning, but then that depends on you getting your sticker in exactly the right position. And then once you've got the sticker on the back, they tend not to stick to the blocks. Now, there is, if you go to Anne Melvin's Positively Papercraft channel, she does have a video showing you a product that really helps with that. I think she's become a bit of an ambassador for the product now as well, so well done to her for that. Yeah, so she's got a way of sort of helping you with that, so that you can have the labels on and you can still see what's going on and they still stick, temporarily stick to the block, because you don't want it to stick forever, unless you've got a fortune and you've got thousands of blocks, but that'd be ridiculous. Now, so yeah, thinking about that's important. If you're really not good at positioning, then you don't need to think about blocks at all. You need to think about a stamping tool, a stamping platform like a Stamparatus, or the one I've got, which is the Tim Holtz stamping platform. There's also the Misty. So there's lots of different things out there. So you might want to use those, or you might want to use something like a Stamp-A-Majig that helps you to position your stamp perfectly. They're really good as well for multi-layer stamping. The best thing, stamping platforms really come into their own when you're doing tons of repeat, or even a few repeats. So if you're trying to make the exact same design, trying to replicate it time and time again and get it perfectly positioned, then a stamping platform really comes into its own for that one. And if you've got multi-layer stamping as well, then obviously your Stamparatus will give you 4 platforms on which to store your stamps. So you could do 4 multi-layer stamping and they'll be identical each time. And even with a Stamparatus or with any other platform, there are still hiccups, there are still problems about positioning and pressure and things like that to consider. Now, talking about positioning and pressure, this is one thing that people can do. These are a few things that people can get wrong when they're stamping. Now, I'm going to stamp this flower in the green again. Now, when you ink up your stamp, make sure that your stamp is covered with ink. Now, that doesn't mean that your block's covered with ink, your fingers are covered with ink and all the bits in between. You've got a raised bit to your stamp, which is what transfers the pattern. So you don't want to be pressing the whole pad into the ink. So you want to be tapping, really, to get your stamp inked up. And some of the ink will come onto the parts of the stamp that you don't want it to come on. And then you just press. Now, that's my pressure that's wrong there. We're going to talk about pressure in a minute. Now, you can see here, this stamp's not coming through right. So maybe I'm not applying enough pressure when I'm putting my ink on. So tap it. And there we have a perfect image. And I have managed to get some on the block and I've got some on the sides. Now, as long as I've got a flat surface, that isn't going to matter. And as long as I'm applying the right amount of pressure, that isn't going to matter. But if I start pressing too hard, if I really press down like this, look at the mess I make. This ink's going to transfer that's got into the spaces. And sometimes you can see on this one, I've got the edge of the stamp showing because I've pressed way too hard. Okay, I've got my ink everywhere and I've pressed way too hard. So let me just try on this one. Just gently. And I print and it comes out. Even that has got an edge on it. Always try and keep your block nice and straight. Make sure your ink pad's nice and straight. Don't have it on a tilt. Don't have it half open, half closed. Don't have it standing on something rocky. Don't hold it in your hand. Have it on a nice flat surface and try to hold your block nice and horizontal as well. Because if you're going like that with it, it's going to get more ink on one side than the other and you're going to have a problem. And then just a gentle application. Don't go like this because that's what's going to happen. You're going to end up with that mess because you press way too hard. So just try and keep everything horizontal. Your paper, your ink pad, your stamp, nicely horizontal. Put it onto your paper, just let some gentle application and then lift off. Okay, you don't have to press it down to make it happen. Again, if I do this one, ink it up, just some gentle application. These are watercolour words. These are supposed to look like watercolours. They're not supposed to look perfect. Maybe I should have chosen something different to demonstrate. Now, what I just said about making sure that your paper's flat. Now, the other day I was doing stamping, doing a demonstration, and I'd accidentally got a stamp underneath my paper. So when I went to try and stamp my stamp, I was like, what's happening there? Why isn't it coming out right? The reason it wasn't coming out right is because I didn't have my paper flat. So get your paper nice and flat. Always make sure it's nice and flat. And another good thing is to have something, a little bit of resistance, a little bit of sponginess underneath your paper. It just gives it a little bit of bounce and just helps a little bit. You don't want your stamp to disappear into next week, but to just have a little bit of bounce, a little bit of firm resistance is quite nice. So you could do it on one of these grid paper pads that Stampin' Up! Demonstrators use all the time. Or you can get little spongy sort of platforms that you can put underneath when you're stamping. And on some of the stamping platforms, you'll find that they do have like a layer of spongy material to get that really good, nice, crisp image. Okay. I'm trying to think of what else. The other thing is if you do make a mistake, think about, does it really matter? If I was printing out this whole sheet of paper and I made that mistake on it, would I abandon the whole thing, or can I work around that for what I'm actually going to make? Or does it just not matter, you know, in the design? Is nobody really going to notice? So don't abandon stuff unnecessarily. The other thing is, when you're printing out a piece of DSP, you can print it randomly. You don't have to think, oh, I need an exact uniform pattern on this, unless that's what you really want. So if you do want a uniform pattern, think about that beforehand. Get out the stamps you're going to use, and then sort of plan it out where you're going to put which stamp, so that you know you're leaving yourself enough space. Use grid paper to help you with that, or a stamping platform to help you with that. The other thing is, if you are stamping out a piece of DSP and you're going to use the whole piece, remember to stamp up to the edges. You know, go over the edges. It's fine to go over the edges because it looks more natural then if you go over the edges and you've not got any white rim around your work. Don't mix colours. Make sure you clean your stamp really well after you've used it. Make sure you clean your blocks really well after you've used it. Otherwise you're going to contaminate your inks with different colours and they're not going to work right. They're not going to come out right ever again. You're going to mess them up. And was there a final thing? When you're doing two-step stamping, always remember to line things up well. Again, when you're demonstrating, it can be very difficult because, especially if you're filming from above, you don't want to lean right over your work. So sometimes you'll see demonstrators pull it off to actually get the perfect image, or they don't quite get the perfect image because they're working on an unusual angle. And that doesn't mean that they're not going to get the perfect image all the time. It just means for that demonstration purposes they might not get the same image. So always bring your work underneath you so you can look right down on it, especially if you're trying to line up stamps. So if that was a second stage stamp, I'd want to make sure that was absolutely perfect. And it's difficult to do if you're not right over the top of it. That's another thing, is if you do a stamp and it doesn't come out quite as perfect as you'd like, then consider, am I ever going to get that lined back up perfectly with that? Never. If I was using a stamping platform, then yes, I could. So I could go back and it would line up perfectly and it would fill in any gaps that I'd missed out. This around here, there's not a lot you can do about it. But again, don't abandon your work if you've got this, because you might find that if you're going to punch this out or die cut it out, that this rubbish piece here that you don't want in the image, that might disappear anyway. And also, if you're demonstrating and that's the one little mistake you've made, then, you know, let people know you've made that mistake and show how you remedy that, even if the way you remedy that is to remove it in editing for your image that you're using as a demonstration. And that is about it, really. Apart from when you're stamping to heat emboss, always use an embossing buddy. That's a little pouch. I'm not going to get mine out now, but it's a little pouch full of powder that you just wipe your paper down with just to remove any static. So your embossing powder is only going to go where you've stamped. Use Versamark. It's the best. It's a really good quality. It lasts forever. Well, it doesn't last forever. It lasts a long time. And it's, you know, it's just a trusted brand to use for heat embossing. It's like an invisible ink that stays tacky for a while, so that you can add things to it. And yeah, always use good quality papers and inks and embossing powders for heat embossing. And I can't think of anything else, really. Just the main thing is to just have fun and just enjoy stamping. And if you get, you know, if you're a little bit nervous about stamping, or you feel like you always make mistakes, you always get the edges on, or you never get a pristine image, or you smudge everything, just practice it. Just do lots. Just get yourself some scrap Whisper White. Most people have plenty of scrap Whisper White, or even these pads. You know, look at all the This is where I've sort of stamped off, or I've obviously stamped around a piece of DSP. And if you've got some offcuts of vellum, offcuts of window sheet, whatever, just practice. Just have a little stamp about with your sentiment stamp. I've got hiccups, sorry. Well, your sentiments and your images, and just practice and enjoy it. And also do acknowledge that sometimes, you know, there are problems with inks. Even the best quality inks, you might get one that's not quite tip-top, or it's got a little bit of a problem with it. So that's it really. There's my sort of top tips for stamping. Always, you know, make sure you wash your hands between colours if you're like me and get covered in colours, because it's easy to pass colours on from one thing to another. And just look after your stamps, keep them nice and clean. Always put them back into the stamp set when you finish with them. Even if you don't put them all back in the proper holes or whatever, put them all back in the box so that you don't lose them. There's nothing worse than not being able to find this, you know, the stamp that you need. So pop them back in the box and keep them nice and safe, and keep them out of direct sunlight. You don't want them going all crispy in there. And, you know, just look after them, just take care of your stamps, and then they should be fine. And the same with your inks, you know. Think about where you're storing them and how you're storing them. Give them a clean before you put them away if you've got ink all over the outside. And just generally take care of things, and then you should be getting the best images you possibly can. Stamps do wear out after a while. After, you know, this one, I've been using it so much, I'm surprised it hasn't worn out already. Because you are pressing down them all the time, so they're getting weaker and they're wearing. But it does take an awful long time for a stamp to wear out. So, you know, and there are obviously sometimes there are problems with stamps. So you might get one and you do everything I've suggested and it's still not printing right. And then you have to think, well, maybe there was a production error, and return it to the manufacturer or the retailer. So I'm not saying that you're always gonna, the problem's always going to be the human error. Sometimes there are machining errors. Although I don't think, there's one stamp I think you'll find me say that about, and it was in, was it in Tulip? I can't remember, was it called Tempting Tulips? And it just won't print, and when you look at it from the side you can see that the relief isn't quite right, so there was a mistake there in manufacture. It's not something I'd bother sending it back for, because you can't get it now anyway, and the rest of the stamp set's so lovely that I wouldn't want to lose it. So yeah, they're my top tips for fabulous stamping. Okay, thank you for watching. See you soon. Bye bye.